Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be getting into episodes 508 through 510, which will cover manga chapters 591 through 593. And we're diving into what is essentially part 2 of the Straw Hat Seperation serial. So yeah, the synopsis. Now that Luffy is on the mend, Rayleigh has a shocking suggestion on what his next move should be, while we also get to catch up with the rest of the Straw Hat crew to see what they've been up to after hearing the news of Ace and Luffy. Alrighty, so differences. There are quite a few differences, and most of it stems from the fact that they wanted to expand on each of the Straw Hats' portion of their story as we catch up with them. Obviously, the main part of the events is pretty similar, but then they add a bunch of things to kind of enhance or fill in some gaps. So one thing also that they add for these episodes is they expand more on Rayleigh explaining to Luffy what his next step should be. And particularly this opening scene of episode 508 where Rayleigh kind of expands on his suggestion is not present in the manga. And in fact, it's mostly left a secret. And it basically only is revealed to us via a conversation that the Marines have about this new plan that they have. Now, getting into the actual Straw Hats, the order in which they're all told is definitely rearranged. I would say that the biggest thing is that they lump together Chopper, Sanji, and Robin towards the end because of how they play out in the fact that they learn the news of Luffy going to Marineford. And so it seems to make a conscious effort to sort of try and tell all these chronologically, where it is, as in the manga, it rearranges things to kind of like obscure the timeline a little bit to make that reveal of Luffy going back to Marineford a much bigger sort of twist. So going through each character's sort of episode, I'll kind of outline what the differences are. And really, for the most part, it's just adding some things either at the beginning or the end of each one. And so in the manga, each character probably gets about 4 pages worth of actual content. So the anime has to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit to make it so that they could fit 2 characters per episode. And I think they do a pretty good job of it. And I have to imagine that a lot of these sort of added story details were approved by Oda. I don't necessarily have any confirmation about that, but it just seems like they were either extrapolated from other pieces of dialogue, like the part about Zoro getting the boat, because that is mentioned in the manga, but it's never, we don't actually get to see where he gets the boat, and in the anime they do show that. But yeah, for Nami's portion of the story in the manga, it actually begins with her already imprisoned in the bubble prison, and so everything prior to that is added. In Frankie's portion, this is really short. In fact, the canon material actually starts after he leaves the house and he's already running through the halls of the Vegapunk lab. And so basically, I think it's like the last 5 minutes of that is really the only material that's actually in the manga. Similarly, during Zoro's story, the scene where Zoro comes into the room while Mihawk is reading the newspaper never actually occurs. The part where he is reading the newspaper and he tells Perona about Moria, that's in the manga. And during this, Zoro is actually already outside fighting the human drills. And along with the portion of the fight where they start copying Zoro's moves is also added for the anime as well. The canon material really only picks up when the humandrils try to heal themselves by applying spit on their wounds, which is a hilarious scene, by the way. But that's from that point on is when the canon material actually begins. Aside from the newspaper scene. For Brook, everything prior to the long-armed tribesmen being caged is all added for the anime. So the part where Brook hands them all the music sheets and them pasting them up, thinking that they are like wards to ward away, evil and whatnot. And the part where he plays his violin to power them up, that's all part of the anime and not in the manga. Chopper's story generally follows the same beats, but every scene and dialogue exchange is just expanded with a couple extra moments. And of course, the addition of the little chick or the big chick is added for the anime as well, as they were a pretty big part of the story earlier on. For Robin, we of course get the conclusion to her story with Soran, which is added into the anime, and most of that is actually pretty canon, apart from the Soran part. And then finally, in the anime, at the end of episode 510, we actually get to see the second newspaper with the article of Luffy going back to Marineford, almost an entire episode or two prior to when we should have had this reveal. Like I mentioned earlier, in the manga, this is actually much more obscured in terms of like what Luffy is going to do. And so when it does get told to us, it's actually a bit more surprising because you see people reacting to the newspaper first, but you don't actually get to see what's on the newspaper. Now it seems like it's the other way around. And I wonder if that was done for more, I would say maybe it was done for more younger audiences to not make it so they get confused, because the anime is skewed more younger than it is the manga. So that may be why they tried to opt for a more chronological storytelling. Okay, so with that laundry list of differences out of the way, let's get into the episodes. To start the episode off, we still don't get to hear explicitly what Rayleigh's suggestion is, but everyone seems to be shocked. But given the context clues, it's what we guessed in the last episode, that Rayleigh wants Luffy to take some extended time to train and get stronger, and Luffy is left wondering how he's going to let everyone know about this extended leave if they're all on their way back to Sabaody. And again, Rayleigh has another suggestion for that as well, but we're yet left wondering what this is. Leading us back to now catching up with Nami on Witheria, she tries to leave with this comically large backpack, similar to the one Usopp left Syrup Village with. She has not lost her roots as a thief, and she takes a bunch of Witheria technology, but is immediately caught and locked up. She gives this incredibly emotional monologue about not being able to be there for Luffy, and this is one roller coaster of a ride of emotions, as we really feel for her, but then it turns out that it was all an act, and in order for her to escape. But once she's out, you then find out she was actually genuine, as Heredis notices that Nami is still crying. Now, this is strictly my own personal opinion, but I think out of everyone on the crew, Nami is probably the one that feels the most empathy for Luffy. While Usopp and Luffy are like brothers, no one on the crew probably feels as indebted to Luffy specifically than Nami. After all, he had done, to believe in her and free her from the pain of being enslaved by Arlong. Nami, more than anyone, feels like she wants to return the favor, but the one time Luffy needed her, she's unable to be there for him, and it kills her for that. And I'm sure many people could make the argument that Robin had the most granted to her by Luffy in terms of what he did for her. It was also far more of a group effort to save Robin, and also Robin just by nature is a little bit more individualistic in her disposition, so I just feel like Nami has a bit more of an attachment to trying to help Luffy. And this observation is pretty obvious, but I thought it's worth mentioning that despite Nami playing off her crying and desperate plea to let her out, I truly believe that those were her genuine feelings, and those were genuine tears that she just has an uncanny ability to hide her emotions on a dime due to her amazing duplicitous skills, that she gained while she was a thief as a kid. But I do think that those were real. It's just that she was able to turn them off really quickly, and once she was out, and she's also kind of like has a hard time still being vulnerable around people that she doesn't really know. And so, she's not going to let them think that she actually was vulnerable there. So I think there's an aspect of that as well. Moving to Frankie, his story isn't really all that interesting other than that he's an idiot, and we learn a little tiny bit more about Vegapunk and how he was a man who truly did want to help people. And I think one thing that people always went back and forth about Vegapunk between the drip feed of information we got about him is where his allegiance and moral compass lied, because of how he keeps developing tech and research for the world government. Is he actually a good guy, or is he an evil guy, or maybe somewhere in between? And to be honest, I always had the impression that Vegapunk was a good guy being forced to work for the world government for his genius. We of course would not find out more about him till later arcs, and more concretely in the most current arc that we're currently in Egghead Island. But this might be a tad bit spoiler, but one thing I find interesting about this moment looking back on it, after having seen the current arc, is how Kitten's grandfather's explanation about how Vegapunk is a man that has many ideas but is often unable to see them through to realization despite his good intentions due to the lack of tech and funds is referenced later and serves as a clue as to where his allegiance lies and why he allied himself with the world government. And this one line of dialogue from the grandfather basically paints the picture of a man that is well-intentioned and wants to help people, but does not have the resources to make those ideas a reality, which is why he aligns himself with the world government kind of apprehensively to try and make the world a better place within the system that is controlling the world, but he also must make some concessions to do work for the world government. Frankie then makes his way to Vegapunk's old lab with a self-destruct button to find a way off the island to get back to Luffy. However, when he gets in the lab, he immediately finds this self-destruct button and pushes it because it has a skull and crossbones, which he mistakes for a pirate button. Like, what? And this has to be one of the most random and dumbest pieces of writing by Oda, I think. I, for the life of me, can't defend the contrived and stupid nature of this turn of events. Like, it just seems really lazy, but also funny at the same time because of how dumb it is. I truly could not tell you what Oda was trying to say with this moment about Frankie, about Vegapunk, or anything, to be quite honest. I don't know if I'm just too stupid to not be able to see what this means, but it just seems so random. Also, what's weird is that this isn't even the first time a mistake like this has been made in the world of One Piece. I mean, this, of course, recalls back to a very famous moment where a skull and crossbones was mistaken for the mark of a pirate and seen as a good thing rather than the sign of danger or death. And that moment is obviously Chopper's flashback where he mistook the poison symbol for something that is good. And the explosion itself also on the island of Baltimore is very reminiscent of the imagery of Helix Sakura blooming at the end of the drum arc. And it's this huge mushroom cloud explosion instead of a huge sort of mushroom cloud shaped Sakura tree. And I have no idea what to even make of this similarity because I can't imagine that this wasn't intentional. Like, is the skull and crossbones not like a universal sign of death in the One Piece world? And is that like a commentary on that? Or it's just the fact that like piracy has been elevated to this higher level of sort of, I don't know, romantic or romanticism, like that people respect it more so than the sign of death? This is so weird. And I honestly don't know what to even make of it. But yeah, Frankie gets blasted away. And of course, we know that Frankie isn't dead, but how he survives an explosion of that size at point blank range is far beyond me. But of course, this is where Frankie's journey becomes a bit clearer in that, like when he was gravely injured after being struck by the puffing Tom, he's probably going to need to rebuild his cyborg body, but now he's got Vegapunk's tech all over the place to further that augmentation. And so he'll probably come out of this far stronger and more advanced in terms of the tech that he's got in his body. And last thing I kind of wanted to mention is also, can we acknowledge that Frankie is in this like winter area and he's wearing a thick winter coat, yet he still refuses to wear pants. And he's still running around there with a Speedo, even though he's got this like really puffy like winter coat on for his upper body. It's just his commitment to that is unreal, but it's also really funny. Yeah, Frankie's story was always an interesting, but ultimately kind of a disappointing tease because it deals with one of the most important and influential characters in the series, Vegapunk, but it doesn't really offer that much information, which is something that always annoyed me about Frankie's part in the Seperation serial, because you want to know more about Vegapunk and it just doesn't give it to you. Anyways, now we get to what I consider to be the most fun and interesting story of the bunch, and this is where Zoro is stuck on Mihawk's island with Perona. And this was definitely the most unexpected yet welcome surprise because it's so random for both Perona and Mihawk to be here. And this begs the question though, by sending Zoro here, are Kuma and Mihawk like friends? Like, I suppose they probably have some kind of working relationship, both being Shibukai members. And I was always curious how Kuma knew to send him here, but we won't learn that till more than a decade later in real time, until just last year in 2023. But and this episode aired, I believe, in 2011, so more than 12 years. And yeah, this is also the actual surprise reveal that Mihawk was on this island and this is his island in the manga. So that, like I mentioned in the last podcast, the first scene with Mihawk showing up on the island, that was added in the anime, and this is how he actually appears in the manga. And him just kind of casually sitting and reading a newspaper while Perona is like wailing at the news of Moria's supposed death. And we do see that the newspaper reports that Moria died in battle at the Paramount War, but we know that Doflamingo and the Pacifistas attempted to terminate him. Although, like Mihawk says, it's unlikely he's actually dead because we never actually see Moria take the fatal blow or see his body. And like with everything in One Piece with Oda, unless you see that body or you see them take that like lethal hit, they're most likely still alive.
We'll be back after a quick break.
The Entertainment District Podcast will review everything from movies to anime. Whether you like comic book movies, shows like Game of Thrones, or just want to debate Krillin versus Tanjiro, the Entertainment District Podcast is the place for you. And trust me, not only are we giving our takes, but we're cracking mad jokes along the way. Listen to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or watch us on YouTube. Again, the Entertainment District Podcast is the place for you.
One thing that the anime does that's interesting is they expand on and make it more apparent that Perona is concerned about Zoro despite her best efforts to cover that up as just general frustration at his ungratefulness. And Zoro and Mihawk have a somewhat contentious vibe going on here as well, but it's evident that Zoro was sent here to train under Mihawk, which is nuts to think about. Like, first off, why would Mihawk train the one that is gunning for his head? And what would make Zoro accept that help, considering how proud he is? And so the baboons, we learn that they're very good at imitating humans, and it was the former inhabitants that caused them to become violent and so strong as they copied their warmongering ways, which is an interesting commentary on how the violent ways of men can even go on to affect their environment and the surrounding ecosystem around them. Also, the baboons' names, the humandrils, is a play on the fact that specifically they are mandrills, which is a type of primate, but because they copy humans, they mash the two together, becoming humandrils, which is, I think, is a very clever naming scheme. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't really get to see too much more of this. In fact, this one, I will say, gets very interesting and probably has one of the more, I don't want to say iconic, but also just a very impactful moment from Zoro. Now, Brook's story, on the other hand, has an interesting aspect that's added to it in the anime. It's this idea that Brook can use his music playing as a buff for people listening, which is something that hasn't been explored all that much, if at all, if I'm remembering correctly. And we saw that when he was first introduced, that his music can affect people. Like, for example, he put a few enemies, and particularly zombies, to sleep with his playing, but beyond that, he hasn't really done much with his music as sort of a form of combat tools. And, you know, being an RPG game fan myself, I honestly thought when Brook joined the crew and I saw that ability, that one of his roles would be similar to how like a bard job class is used in many JRPGs like Final Fantasy and stuff like that, where their music is used as buffs for allies or debuffs to enemies. And we've already seen something very similar early on in the story with Django and his hypnosis, you know, buffing people to the point where they can like bust through rocks. And, you know, this might be, again, slightly spoilery, but sadly, that's really never explored with Brook. Instead, Oda takes a very different approach with Brook after he comes out of this sort of training arc, as it were, which is kind of disappointing, but I also still actually enjoy what Oda eventually does with Brook. But I just kind of wished that his music was incorporated a little bit more into his power set. The one thing I want to mention about Chopper's portion of the Seperation serial is how the anime made the sequencing a bit more explicit and easier to understand. The manga isn't confusing by any means, but like I mentioned in the differences section, it does kind of require you to put things together and rearrange them in your head rather than the story chronologically telling you. So in the manga, Chopper's story is actually the second one you're shown just after Usopp, which was right after Rayleigh gave Luffy this mysterious suggestion. And in the manga, you're never even shown the scene of Rayleigh hinting that the suggestion was to go back to Marineford for some unknown reason. So in the manga, when you read Chopper's part, you're really on the edge of your seat wondering what Luffy did and what Rayleigh's suggestion was. And it's not till you're finished with the check-ins from everyone, not just the Straw Hats, but the entire world, that you get to see what Chopper saw here in the newspaper, as well as what Rayleigh's plan was. The manga builds more tension and mystery with this sequencing, while the anime makes it more apparent what's happening here. And I say that because in the manga, you can infer it, but it's not explicitly, that the other members have only seen the initial news that Ace has died, but it seems like everyone apart from Chopper, Robin, and Sanji never see the second newspaper, which the anime groups together for you to drive home the point for what I would assume is younger audiences. Eventually, all the members do get to see the second newspaper, and we do get to see them react to the second newspaper. But in this initial run, we only get to see Chopper, Robin, and Sanji read this second newspaper and see them react to it. And I'll be honest, when it comes to Robin's part of the story, I often forget what I'm supposed to know by this point. So I'm going to try and be very careful about spoilers, because I'm starting to get jumbled up as to like what you as the reader and watcher should already know about the Revolutionary Army and Robin, and what you shouldn't know, because it's starting to get melded together. And the reason why it's so hard is because there's this very complicated web of events and flashbacks told out of chronological order, and I sometimes have a hard time keeping track of when exactly I learned them in the story. However, putting things together with what we do know, it makes a little more sense why Kuma sent Robin here, despite its terrible location and sort of the danger that it almost put Robin in. Kuma must have been in contact with Dragon that the Revolutionary Army was going to raid Tequila Wolf, and he sent Robin there in the hopes that she would be saved by them and putting her in contact with Dragon. And this would be beneficial for both her and Dragon, just as Robin says she has her nakama to protect her from the world government, but if they're all going to be separated for a little while, training, then the next safest place for Robin would be with the Revolutionary Army and Dragon. And then for Dragon's side, Robin could obviously exchange what information she knows about fighting the world government and anything on the ancient kingdom. Now we get to our final one with Sanji, where Ivankov returns to their island, and we get an interesting pairing of Ivankov meeting one of Luffy's crew. And I love the scene where Ivankov runs through the crew's bounty posters, and you see Sanji's like over-the-top reactions, particularly him going from Zoro's like, screw him, to Nami's like, lovey-dovey, like, meroring. And then you almost see this like incredibly neutral, with Usopp. And that scene is so funny, like him just going like this manic change in emotions depending on which bounty poster is put in front of him. Then, of course, the gag that never stops giving with Sanji's ridiculous wanted poster comes back as well, with him not being able to admit it's him, yet having to admit it's him, and it even like causes him to cough blood up, which is absurd. But Sanji's placement on Momoiro Island with Ivankov is an interesting one because it's not quite apparent what he's there to work on like the others are now. It could be to get physically stronger, as Ivankov is shown to be an incredibly durable and strong fighter, but it could also be more to deal with his weakness when it comes to women, of course. We've kind of explored this in past podcasts, but yeah, that could be another thing. Of course, we now know that Kuma sent Sanji here because Kuma knew it would be safe with Ivankov being one of his friends, or at least former friends before he lost his sort of sentience. The episode ends with a shocking reveal that Luffy has gone back to Marineford for some reason, and it can be seen in the newspaper. He's just standing there with his hat on his chest, eyes closed, as if he's paying respects, most likely to Ace and Whitebeard. But the biggest question is why he did this and why Rayleigh wanted him to do this. Like, why would Rayleigh suggest such a risky move? And you can even see in the picture that Luffy is in the process of being attacked by a squad of troops, which I would assume that Jinbei and Rayleigh are holding back. But one thing, if you're really paying attention, is, and it's a blink and you'll miss it moment, is Luffy has some sort of tattoo now on his right arm, kind of similar to Ace with a couple letters crossed out, much like Ace's. And if you look carefully, it says 3D2Y with the 3D crossed out. And I kind of forget what the reaction and discourse was in sort of the general community at the time, because I was a little tuned out of the wider community during this time in my life. But I remember thinking to myself particularly that this was definitely a message that he was trying to send out to the crew, that he needed more time to train and they should all do the same. And I just didn't know what exactly the message was. And in fact, I will admit, I never even noticed the 3D2Y tattoo until it was pointed out to me. But just in case you want to be left in the dark, I won't go too far into it, as it's not too much longer till we do understand what the tattoo actually means. One last little fun fact I will leave you anime-only watchers with is during the scene where Dragon is talking with Ivankov over the Dendenmushi, there is curiously two of them sitting next to each other, and one is clearly the one Dragon is talking to Ivankov with, as it looks just like him, but the white one sitting next to it seemingly doing nothing, it has just this lone wire connecting to the other one. However, in the manga, we get a little title box actually introducing this little guy, and it's in fact an anti-bugging disruptor Dendenmushi, and it basically sends out a telepathic wave to disrupt anyone from surveilling the conversation, essentially creating an encrypted line of communication between two Dendenmushis. And it also specifically labels that these white Dendenmushis are very rare, and that's actually written in parentheses in that same title box. So yeah, if you're wondering what that white Dendenmushi is, it's explained in the manga, but I don't know why they don't explain it in the anime. But yeah, we'll have to wait to see what reason Luffy had for going back to Marineford, and to see what's in store for the rest of the Straw Hats and the rest of the series, because this is the first time in a while where it wasn't quite clear what was in store for the story, and it was a pretty exciting time, as it seemed like it was building towards a shift in the narrative in terms of One Piece. And so, yeah, we'll keep rolling on until the end of this arc. But if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and Twitter account at SunnyGoPodcast for updates when I post new episodes. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. There's going to be a small spoiler section, but if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! All right, so spoiler section, just kind of random musings. Mostly this one I want to talk about how a lot of this connects to the current arc, Egghead. And I think, one of the first things is we do eventually go on to see during the second Ohara flashback during the Egghead Island arc is Vegapunk's conversation with Dragon, that he did in fact reject his invitation to join the revolutionaries, and he joined the world government because they were too rich or too poor to fund his research. It kind of falls in line with what Kiton's grandfather was talking about, how he just never had the resources to complete a lot of his research, and that's why he ended up aligning with the world government. And so we get a confirmation about that. And then, of course, we knew why Akuma sent Robin to Dragon, but now we know so much more of how intertwined Robin, Kuma, Dragon, and Vegapunk all were, thanks to Kuma's flashback, and just how much Dragon was invested in protecting Robin was because, for one, he was good friends with Clover, and he was actually very, very sad about the tragedy that occurred on Ohara, and probably Dragon felt, I think, to some degree, wanting to help Robin right off the get-go, but he was just too late and could never find her. And so, it's very interesting to see all these sort of disparate storylines coming together in Egghead Island. And I think that's one of the reasons why Egghead is so amazingly fun, is because of just how many different sort of storylines are converging all at once again. And just how integral Vegapunk, the Revolutionary Armies, Dragon, Kuma, the Straw Hats, all of them all combined together, and it makes a really fun story. And then also it's very fun to look back on these, because obviously Vegapunk is mentioned in Frankie's portion of the story as well as Robin's, and so we get to see many of all of this, because Kuma is such a big part of Egghead, we do see like all the decisions that Kuma made here and what it led to was him. And he's like become one of the like unsung heroes or MVPs in the Straw Hats in terms of saving them and getting them to the point where they are now. And just kind of going back and seeing just all of Kuma's work kind of come to fruition is pretty amazing, to be honest. Like I think that's one of the more satisfying developments that we've seen in Egghead. But yeah, that's kind of all I really wanted to talk about. And yeah, I'm sure there's plenty more I could say, you know, with Mihawk and Zoro. But we'll obviously talk more about Mihawk and Zoro when we get to that portion where he does actually beg him to train him, which is an awesome scene. And yeah, so we'll talk more about all of that later. But yeah, thanks for listening, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.